In the years leading up to Guadalcanal, Japanese intelligence officers carried themselves with a quiet, almost mathematical confidence. Since 1937, their cryptologic units, the Army's 8th Section and the Navy's powerful D Bureau, had penetrated foreign codes with alarming success. They read Chinese nationalist communications with ease, monitored British colonial traffic across Malaya and Hong Kong, and even broke multiple low-level American Army and Navy systems. Their greatest triumph was the diplomatic cipher machine the Americans called Purple, a sophisticated electric encoder used by the U.S. State Department. Through an extraordinary feat of reverse engineering that rivaled anything produced in Europe, Japanese cryptologists reconstructed the machine's logic and began reading American diplomatic traffic before the Pacific War even started. Tokyo knew when U.S. ambassadors complained, when envoys negotiated, when Washington issued warnings. To Japanese intelligence, it felt as if American codes had seams, weak points that split open under patient analysis. And that belief hardened into doctrine. America relied on radio, and radio meant vulnerability. By late 1941, Japanese cryptologists were intercepting thousands of Allied messages each month. They had cracked the code books used by U.S. Army units in the Philippines. They read Australian signals during the retreat from Rabaul. They identified convoy routes, reinforcement timetables, and gaps in coastal defenses. In Malaya, Japanese naval radio units tracked British movements so accurately that commanders joked they hardly needed reconnaissance aircraft. In Hong Kong, Japanese cryptologists read the colony's distress signals in real time. Even as the Pacific War expanded, Japanese intelligence remained convinced of their superiority. They believed the Americans, like the British, would continue using predictable, rigidly structured codes built around English phrases. But in mid-1942, as the American Marines secured a beachhead on Guadalcanal, Japanese radio units began hearing something they had never encountered. Long streams of spoken transmissions, fast, clipped, rhythmic, and utterly incomprehensible. The voices were American, but the sounds were something else entirely. It was a language unlike Chinese dialects, unlike Malay, or unlike Polynesian languages. It had no tonal pattern the Japanese could chart. It had no repeated word endings to map. There were no written references to consult, no dictionaries, no captured code books. Japanese linguists brought in from Formosa and Shanghai stared at the phonetic transcriptions in frustration. The words didn't match any language family they recognized. What made the mystery more unsettling was that the Americans were using these transmissions for critical traffic, artillery corrections, unit movements, air support coordination. Japanese listening posts could hear the urgency, the cadence, the tactical significance, yet not a single syllable yielded meaning. They assumed at first it might be a Polynesian dialect or perhaps a native Hawaiian code, but those languages were known in academic circles. This was something different. Japanese analysts believed their track record gave them time. They would isolate phonemes, apply frequency analysis, and build a reference framework. But within days, they realized something was wrong. There were no repeating patterns. The same message sent twice produced different word sequences. Attempts to apply standard cryptanalytic methods yielded nothing. In Tokyo, senior officers dismissed the issue as temporary. They reminded their subordinates that they had broken Purple, defeated British and Dutch codes, and kept up with the dynamic ciphers of the Chinese warlords. If the Americans thought they could hide behind an exotic language, they were mistaken. Japanese intelligence had cracked every American system they had ever encountered. They would crack this too. But they didn't understand what they were hearing, not yet. They didn't realize that this language was not just unfamiliar, it was structurally unlike anything in their cryptologic experience. The Japanese had built their SIGINT empire on the assumption that all codes were written systems, created by engineers, diplomats, or staff officers. Systems with rules, systems that could be mapped, systems that followed the constraints of alphabets. What they were hearing now, a rapid-fire exchange spoken by U.S. Marines operating radios near Henderson Field, was a code built on something they had never trained for: a human language with no standardized writing system, virtually no representation in academic linguistics, and a phonetic structure that defied pattern analysis. And to make matters worse, it wasn't even raw Navajo. The Americans were twisting it again, overlaying it with additional coded metaphors. To the Japanese listening post on Guadalcanal, Bougainville, and New Georgia, it was as if the Americans had suddenly begun communicating in sound itself, pure meaning hidden inside an impenetrable rhythm. For the first time in the Pacific War, Japanese cryptologists found themselves staring at intercept sheets not with confidence, but with bewilderment. They had broken purple. They had read American diplomats like open books. But now, on the shores of an island they barely knew existed, they were encountering the one system they would never break. And they didn't understand that the voices coming over the radios, urgent, calm, uncrackable, belonged to a group of Marines whose existence would alter the entire course of the Pacific War.
The idea that would eventually cripple Japanese signals intelligence did not begin in a laboratory, a cryptologic bureau, or even a military staff office. It began in the mind of a Marine officer who understood something few in Washington did. The most unbreakable code in the world might already exist, not in machines or mathematics, but in the living memory of a people whose language had never been bent into the structures cryptologists expected. Major General Clayton Vogel, stationed on the West Coast in early 1942, had heard rumors that Native American languages, especially Navajo, were almost impossible for outsiders to learn. But what caught his attention was not their complexity alone, it was their obscurity. Fewer than 30 non-Navajo people in the world spoke the language fluently, and those few were missionaries or anthropologists, none of whom lived anywhere near the Pacific Theater. Navajo had no standardized written form, no alphabet widely taught outside the community, and no presence in global academia. It was a linguistic fortress long before the Marines ever touched it. Vogel met with a civilian named Philip Johnston, the son of a missionary who had grown up on the Navajo reservation and spoke the language fluently. Johnston explained what made Navajo unique: its verb-heavy structure, tonal shifts, complex compound words, and a syntax so distinct that even skilled linguists struggled to map it. More importantly, Johnston had already tested the concept. He arranged a demonstration in February 1942 at Camp Elliott, where Navajo speakers transmitted messages in their own language faster than Marine cryptographers could encode the same message using standard codebooks, and with zero errors. The Marines were stunned. Vogel made his recommendation immediately: recruit Navajo speakers and develop a battlefield-ready code. That spring, the Marine Corps recruited 29 Navajo men, the group now known as the Original 29. They arrived at boot camp in May 1942, not knowing they were about to become the architects of one of the most effective encryption systems in human history. After graduation, they were sent to Camp Elliott to begin constructing what no other military in the world possessed: a spoken code that could move as fast as thought. The building of the code was not simple translation. The Marines needed vocabulary for military terms that had no equivalent in Navajo. So the code talkers created metaphors rooted in Navajo culture. A tank became che dagahi, turtle. A fighter plane was dahedihi, hummingbird. A battleship was lo tso, big whale. The letters of the alphabet were coded too, each mapped to a Navajo word beginning with the corresponding English sound. This double-layered system, a native language overlaid with metaphor, meant that even a fluent Navajo speaker would not understand messages without the codebook memorized. No written copies were permitted. Everything lived in the minds of the code talkers. By the time the Marines landed on Guadalcanal in August 1942, 42 Navajo code talkers were deployed across the Pacific. The presence was quiet, almost invisible. They carried radios like any other signalman. They dug foxholes, ate rations, endured malaria and monsoon rains. But when transmissions came in or needed to go out, something extraordinary happened. A message that would have taken marine cryptographers 2 or 3 minutes to encode with a codebook was sent in 20 seconds. The language flowed fast, fluid, unguessable, untouched by the structure Japanese cryptologists expected from an encrypted system. Japanese listening posts intercepted these transmissions immediately. They flagged them as high-priority traffic because of their rate and content. They clearly carried operational importance. But when analysts attempted to break them, they encountered a problem so fundamental that it shook the core of their assumptions. Navajo did not behave like a cipher. There were no repeated sequences, no statistically significant patterns, no context words, no markers for rank, unit, or timing. Even worse, the transmissions did not follow the rigid phrase structures of English. The Japanese Army's top linguists couldn't even identify the language family. Some believed it was a code spoken phonetically. Others suspected it was an engineered jargon designed to mimic natural speech. Meanwhile, the Japanese Navy's D Bureau, whose officers had cracked purple, declared early intercepts insufficient for linguistic analysis. That phrase, repeated in internal memos through 1942 and 1943, was a quiet admission of defeat. They could hear everything, they understood nothing. For the Marines, the system worked flawlessly. On Guadalcanal, Navajo code talkers coordinated artillery strikes, relayed air support requests, and helped direct the defense of Henderson Field during the Japanese offensives in September and October. Their messages were never delayed, never misinterpreted, never compromised. A battalion commander later said, "Navajo messages arrived with such speed that it felt like the battlefield itself was speaking back." By the end of 1942, the Marine Corps realized they had created something unprecedented. A code so secure it did not require replacement for the entire war. It was a system that scaled naturally. More code talkers could be added without exposing patterns, and one that could not be reverse engineered because it did not exist on paper. Only in memory, only in the minds of the men who carried radios through jungles, over ridge lines, across beaches, and into some of the bloodiest battles of the Pacific. And somewhere deep in the Japanese cryptologic offices, analysts continued staring at transcripts of intercepted messages, unaware that they were trying to decode not a machine, not a cipher, not a codebook, but a living language woven into metaphors they would never understand.
By early 1943, Japanese intelligence officers were growing frustrated. They had intercepted months of American radio traffic from Guadalcanal, Bougainville, and the Solomon Islands, traffic that moved quickly, carried operational weight, and clearly mattered to the battlefield, yet not a single fragment of it had yielded meaning. The Imperial Army's 8th Section increased manpower, assigning linguists who had worked on Chinese dialects and Southeast Asian languages. The Navy's D Bureau, famous for reconstructing the purple diplomatic machine, requested every sample of these mysterious voice transmissions. They expected to find patterns, syllabic correlations, maybe even fragments that hinted at grammatical structure. Instead, they faced something infuriating. Every time the Americans sent a message, the word sequences changed, even when the operational meaning was identical. Cryptologists assumed at first that the transmissions were English phrases disguised as a foreign language. But that theory fell apart when even English-trained analysts could not locate structural anchors. No repeating verbs, no identifiable syntax markers, no consistent sentence shapes. What made the situation worse was that the Americans kept using the system in moments of highest urgency. The Japanese could tell these messages were about artillery missions, air support direction, and infantry maneuvering, but they could not break into the language itself, much less the encoded military metaphors layered on top. In mid-1943, Japanese intelligence attempted its most direct approach.
They interrogated Navajo civilians captured in the Philippines and Shanghai, hoping to gain insight into the language. Those civilians, none of whom were trained code talkers, explained Navajo conversational structure as best they could. But when presented with intercepted marine transmissions, they could not decipher them. The Japanese were baffled. How could native speakers fail to understand their own language? They did not realize that the U.S. Marine Corps' Navajo code was not simply spoken Navajo. It was a cryptologic overlay, a dual system in which words were substituted with metaphorical stand-ins. Turtle for tank, iron fish for submarine, hummingbird for fighter plane. Without the memorized codebook, even a fluent Navajo speaker would not understand the military meaning. The Japanese then applied frequency analysis, the foundation of cryptology since the early 20th century. But the method collapsed immediately. Navajo's verb-heavy construction, multiple affixes, irregular syllables, and tonal variations created a soundscape that did not repeat in the predictable ways of alphabet-based languages. And once the code talkers layered their metaphorical system on top, any hope of analysis evaporated. One Navy analyst noted in an internal report that the spoken code is not a language, but a storm of sounds without anchor. That line, preserved in post-war archives, reveals just how completely Japanese signals intelligence had been defeated. During the Bougainville campaign in late 1943, Japanese listeners attempted to triangulate meaning by matching transmission spikes with battlefield events. They recorded Navajo transmissions during artillery barrages and infantry pushes, then cross-referenced them with American actions. But the speed of the Navajo system ruined even this effort. Messages were transmitted and acted on so quickly that the Japanese could not map cause and effect. Before an analyst could even complete a transcription, American artillery had already shifted their fire. Aircraft had already launched from Henderson Field or Torquay, and Marines had already moved forward or fallen back. As the war continued, the scale of the problem grew. The Americans deployed more code talkers, eventually between 375 and 420 across 6 Marine divisions, artillery regiments, and signal companies. Every new code talker expanded the system without creating any new vulnerability, because the code lived in memory, not on paper. The Japanese captured codebooks from American units in New Guinea and the Philippines, but none contained Navajo material. They found no written traces of the code anywhere. By late 1944, Japanese cryptologists reached an uncomfortable conclusion. The Americans were using a spoken cipher that could not be reverse-engineered by any known linguistic or mathematical method. The Army's 8th Section, usually proud and blunt, submitted a rare concession in writing. This method remains undecipherable. The Navy's D Bureau used even harsher language: no progress, no structure, no pattern. Meanwhile, the practical consequences of this failure mounted on the battlefield. At Saipan, Japanese counterattacks were shattered because Marine commanders could shift their defenses with perfect coordination. At Peleliu, the Americans used Navajo transmissions to bring artillery fire onto cave systems within minutes. On Leyte and Luzon, code talkers helped coordinate the American advance so smoothly that Japanese staffs assumed the U.S. Army had doubled its communications units. But the worst blow came during the invasion of Iwo Jima. Japanese intelligence had prepared for months to intercept and disrupt American communications on the island. Yet when the landings began in February 1945, Navajo transmissions poured across the airwaves in a steady, unstoppable flow. Japanese analysts, unable to decipher even the simplest message, simply logged and filed them, aware they carried vital meaning, but permanently locked out. This was the moment when Japanese signals intelligence realized the unthinkable. The Americans had created a code Japan would never break. They had defeated codebooks, machine ciphers, and radio discipline before. But this living, breathing, spoken code was something beyond their reach. And for the first time since the war began, the cryptologic tables had turned completely. The imperial forces, once the masters of interception, were now deaf.
By mid-1944, the Navajo code talkers were no longer an experimental asset. They had become the backbone of U.S. Marine Corps battlefield communications, woven into the command structure of every major assault force from the Central Pacific to the Marianas. Their presence transformed operations in ways Japanese commanders could neither predict nor counter. When the Marines hit Saipan in June 1944, the code talkers were embedded directly into regimental and battalion headquarters, moving with the assault waves under fire. As rifle companies fought through sugarcane fields and urban rubble, Navajo radio men sent messages with a speed and clarity commanders had never experienced before. A battalion commander later said that with Navajo communications, our unit moved as if tied together by a single wire. During the fiercest fighting at Saipan, near Garapan and Mount Tapushao, Navajo code talkers relayed more than 800 messages within the first 48 hours without a single error. Forward observers used them to direct naval gunfire from battleships offshore. Mortar platoons relied on them to shift fire in real time. Air liaison teams used them to call in strikes from Marine Corsairs and Navy Hellcats. Japanese units attempting counterattacks were met with instant, devastating American responses because code talkers could transmit a fire mission in 20 seconds, a process that previously required several minutes with conventional encryption. Time became lethality. Speed became survival. The Japanese defenders of Saipan were stunned. Their doctrine assumed that once American units became engaged in close combat, their radio networks would falter and the battle would devolve into disconnected local fights. Instead, the Americans fought like a single organism, artillery shifting with precision, armor units pivoting flawlessly, infantry companies coordinating flanks without delay. Japanese officers noted bitterly in after-action reports that the Americans had no hesitation in communication, a phrase that revealed how deeply Navajo transmissions were reshaping the battlefield. But it was on Iwo Jima in February 1945 that the code talkers reached the pinnacle of their wartime contribution. The island, only 8 square miles of volcanic rock, was the most heavily fortified patch of ground the Japanese had ever constructed. General Tadamichi Kurebayashi had designed a defense built around interlocking caves, underground artillery chambers, and hidden machine guns that could fire from multiple angles. He knew American communications would determine the battle's tempo. He believed that he could disrupt their coordination even briefly. He could inflict casualties high enough to slow the advance to a crawl. Instead, the Navajo code talkers made American coordination nearly instantaneous. On D-Day alone, 8 teams of code talkers landed with the first waves of the 4th and 5th Marine Divisions. They dug foxholes in black volcanic ash while Japanese machine guns swept the beach. Within minutes, Navajo messages were flowing from frontline platoons to battalion HQ, then to regimental fire control centers and offshore naval gunfire ships. They communicated the locations of Japanese strongpoints, adjusted rocket launcher fire, and coordinated tank infantry movements through terrain that swallowed radios in static. In the first 48 hours of the battle, 6 pairs of code talkers handled over 800 messages, every one accurate. Their transmissions allowed Marines to bypass strongpoints, bring flamethrower tanks to bear on cave mouths, and rescue pinned-down companies by shifting artillery within meters of friendly positions. Lieutenant General Howland Mad Smith, commander of the Expeditionary Force, received near real-time battlefield updates because Navajo radio men could relay observations faster than runners could report them. But the most famous assessment came from Major Howard Connor, signal officer of the 5th Marine Division. On Iwo Jima, he had 6 code talkers working around the clock during the island's most desperate days. When the battle ended, Connor said, "Were it not for the Navajos, the Marines would never have taken Iwo Jima." Connor was not exaggerating. Japanese counterattacks on Iwo Jima were timed to exploit gaps created by terrain, hoping to isolate American companies. But Navajo transmissions closed those gaps instantly. A flanking attempt at Nishi Ridge was repulsed because code talkers relayed the threat and brought down mortar fire in minutes. At Hill 362, Marines nearly lost their foothold until Navajo messages called in armor support and shifted artillery to sever a Japanese infiltration route. Throughout the battle, Japanese signal intelligence units continued intercepting every transmission. They heard every request, every fire mission, every coordinate, and yet they learned nothing. The rhythm of Navajo speech was too rapid to transcribe in real time, and the metaphor system too abstract to decode even with recordings. Kodebayashi's staff, desperate for intelligence, described the American communications as a flowing river with no channels. By the time the flag went up on Mount Suribachi, the Japanese High Command understood a grim truth. The Americans had deployed a communication system that was not just secure, it was immune. It could not be broken by analysis, captured by seizure of documents, or undermined by conventional countermeasures. It existed entirely in the minds of young Marines who carried radios through smoke, sand, and murderous crossfire. Each message they sent was a blow against an enemy who could hear everything but understand nothing. And as the war moved toward Okinawa and the final push toward Japan, the code talkers remained the one American system the Japanese could neither disrupt nor decipher. Their voices, urgent, steady, and unbreakable, became the unseen architecture of every victory.
By the final year of the war, even as Japanese intelligence units desperately tried to recover from successive defeats across the Pacific, one truth had solidified within their cryptologic circles. The Americans possessed a code the Empire would never break. It was not a machine cipher like the U.S. Army's Sagaba. It was not a mathematical system like naval shackle or high-level Pacific Fleet traffic. It was something far stranger, something that violated the very assumptions upon which Japanese cryptology had been built. It was a language, a living, breathing, spoken code carried only in memory by a few hundred Marines who walked the beaches and jungles of the Pacific with radios slung over their shoulders. And for Japan, this was the most devastating revelation of all. Japanese cryptologic doctrine rested on predictability. Every codebook was built by humans, every cipher created through patterns, every language reducible to structure. Purple, once considered impregnable, fell to reverse engineering because its machine logic could be reconstructed. U.S. Army M209 traffic could be broken because operators made predictable errors. British, Dutch, and Chinese codes collapsed because they followed grammatical habits that left microscopic openings. But Navajo was unlike any of these systems. It was not just unfamiliar, it was fundamentally incompatible with the tools and assumptions of modern cryptanalysis. First, Navajo had no standardized written form during the war. Japanese analysts trained to chart letter frequencies and map phonetic repetitions found themselves staring at sound sequences with no alphabetic equivalent. In English, even encrypted English, certain patterns repeat in predictable ways: articles, verb endings, structural markers. In Navajo, verbs could encapsulate entire sentences, nouns could shift form based on subtle pronunciation changes, and meaning could hinge on tonal qualities utterly foreign to Japanese linguists. A language without an alphabet becomes a code without seams. Second, the Navajo code talkers added a second encryption layer by using metaphor-based substitutions. A tank was not tank, it was turtle. A bomber was buzzard. Submarine? Iron fish. The alphabet system used Navajo words whose English initials matched the intended letter, creating a phonetically hidden mapping invisible unless the operator understood both languages intimately. To a Japanese listener, this meant that even if they could learn Navajo perfectly, the messages would still appear nonsensical. They were decoding a language that had been intentionally twisted into a military lexicon only the code talkers themselves knew. Third, the code was too fast for Japanese intercept teams to analyze. A trained Navajo code talker could transmit a message in 20 seconds that took American cryptographers 2 to 3 minutes with conventional systems. Japanese analysts often could not even complete phonetic transcription before the battlefield had transformed. By the time a message was written down, the operation it described was already complete. The units had moved, the artillery had fired, the aircraft had struck. Meaning requires context, and the Navajo system denied Japan both meaning and time. Fourth, and perhaps most decisive, the Americans never changed the code from 1942 to 1945, not once. In all of military history, almost no encryption system has remained static for 3 continuous years of major combat operations. The British changed ultra keys daily. The Germans changed Enigma settings constantly. Even Japanese Army and Navy codes were rotated, sometimes monthly, sometimes weekly, because they assumed the Americans were making progress. But the Navajo code remained untouched because it was never compromised. No Navajo code talker was captured. No codebook existed. No written record survived that could be seized. The system lived only in memory, and memories could not be stolen. Japanese intelligence officers realized this too late. After the war, during occupation debriefings, they admitted that they had not even identified the language being spoken. They had guessed. Some thought it was Hopi, others Cherokee, still others assumed it was a Polynesian hybrid. None came close. The closest attempt came from a linguist who speculated that it might be a modified Apache dialect, but even that was only a half-educated guess. While Japan failed completely, the U.S. Army and Navy were breaking almost every Japanese code they encountered. U.S. Navy cryptanalysts penetrated JN-25, the operational code used by the combined fleet, allowing Nimitz to know the Japanese battle plan at Midway. Army cryptologists broke JN-40, JN-152, and the water transport codes, giving MacArthur precise knowledge of Japanese troop convoys. The contrast was brutal. Japan heard everything and understood nothing. America read everything and revealed nothing. By 1945, the Navajo code talkers had participated in every major marine operation: Guadalcanal, Tarawa, Bougainville, Saipan, Tinian, Peleliu, Iwo Jima, and Okinawa. They sent thousands of messages. Not one was compromised, not one was decoded, not one was delayed. In the history of warfare, no other code, not Enigma, not Sagaba, not Purple, remained perfect for this long in this many battles under this much pressure. When the war ended, the code talkers were sworn to secrecy. Their mission remained classified until 1968. America had won the war with a code Japan never understood existed. And when the truth finally emerged 2 decades later, historians realized that the Navajo language had done what no machine, no mathematician, no algorithm had ever accomplished. It had beaten the finest cryptologic minds of an entire empire simply by existing. The Japanese had broken nearly every American code they encountered, but against a living language shaped by centuries of oral tradition, guarded by memory, and wielded by Marines under fire, their cryptologic mastery met its absolute limit. The Navajo Code was the only system in the Pacific War never broken, not once, not even close, and its legacy stands as one of the greatest cryptographic triumphs in the history of modern warfare.